Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of my favorite scientists to pick on. Now, recently he popped up in a YouTube short video, and I think it was on him being on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he was talking about how eyewitness testimony is not that credible. So he gives this story of how it was his third round in jury duty, and the judge was asking people, could you convict someone? And when the question got to Neil deGrasse Tyson, he responded with something along the lines of, on eyewitness testimony alone, I could not convict someone. And, in explaining this a little more, he's like, that's not really credible. It's not enough. Eyewitness testimony is just not scientific enough. And so, we need beyond eyewitness testimony. And so then the judge asked the rest of the jurors, he said, is there anybody else who couldn't convict a person on one eyewitness testimony? And Neil then just talks about the anguish of his soul on the inside and how he was like, I just wanted to correct that judge. It took everything in me not to correct the judge. And he even explains that the juror sitting in front of him was like, hey, that's not what this guy just said. And I really don't believe that happened, Neil. But anyway, he said, that's not what this guy said. And as Neil is describing this, he is showing in his example how eyewitness testimony, he said, Judge, just 20 seconds ago, you were eyewitness to what I just said and you got it wrong. Now, here is where Neil gets it wrong. Neil might have been right about the judge misunderstanding, or Neil might have been wrong about what the judge was understanding. Neil expressed that on eyewitness testimony alone, that he couldn't convict somebody. He was expressing a viewpoint that he truly believes in. Now, Neil then assumes that the judge is asking everyone, based off a misunderstanding of what Neil said, if they could convict off of one eyewitness testimony. Now, how do we know at this part that the judge didn't have more information? And I believe the judge would know all this background information. The judge might have known that there was only going to be one eyewitness testimony, and maybe what the judge was doing at that point was reframing the context and just asking broad scope and just saying, hey, is there anyone here that on one eyewitness testimony couldn't convict? I want to go ahead and know this fact out front. Neil, one of our greatest scientists, is admitting to jumping to a conclusion about what he thought that the judge thought that he thought, kind of a scenario. Do you get where I'm going? Now, all of this is a setup because Neil believes that science is superior to the Bible, especially on matters considered like creation, or that science is superior to religion because science is what that is taking us into the future, and mankind's knowledge is superior over religion in so many shapes, forms, and fashions. And at the bare minimum, what Neil is setting up for here is the credibility of the Bible, the testimony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, testifying that Jesus Christ was God, that he died, or he came down here, lived, died, and rose again. And so if Neil, by giving these side comments and these side illustrations, can show that eyewitness testimony is not that credible, then science is above God, and especially, with all of the checks and balances within the scientific community. That's what the backdrop of this was for. But even in Neil's illustration, what he shows is that possibly he jumped to a conclusion. Now, I haven't seen the extended version of this. Maybe it was a little more laid out, but there was the miniature version, and I'm pretty sure whoever put the miniature YouTube short up probably hit the highlights and probably gave us enough information to work from. Well, this being stated, is science better than eyewitness testimony, or is science itself based on eyewitness testimony? And yes, at times it may or may not be credible. We do understand this. But there's a better question than whether eyewitness testimony is sometimes credible or sometimes isn't. And it's, Is the eyewitness testimony truthful or sometimes not truthful? Because that actually matters a lot more. Well, let's just think about this for a second. Do you realize that science, the groundwork of science, is absolutely based off of eyewitness testimony? The bedrock data, the bedrock facts are written down by those who think and believe the information they have is correct, etc., obviously until proved otherwise. Now, the refinement process and the peer review process should bring some comfort to our heart, and I actually think that is a good thing, and yes, we have made progress with this. But is it foolproof? Is it totally 100% accurate? And I don't think anybody would say it's 100% accurate. But consider this. Einstein's theory of relativity, according to some, has 3,000 books and papers peer-reviewed and written against it, and you can't turn it over. It doesn't matter if people have pointed out the problems in the math, or if people have shown that he borrowed things incorrectly, or he used incorrect metaphors to explain things. It doesn't matter. Einstein, because he is so popular, his theories cannot be overturned. So then, what do you think about peer review? Is it sharp enough to accurately lead us at all times in all directions? Does the scientific community also share readily that we get ahead by educated guesses? Just like trial and error of a guy who is desperate to fix his car, and he's like, I'm not sure if it's the battery or the starter or the solenoid or the computer box or the wiring or the fuses. I don't know. And he starts guessing and replacing parts. Science moves ahead in the exact same fashion. Now, yes, there is a lot to learn. But as you're going into a new frontier, the scientist always has to say, hey, I think this might work. And then by trial and error, by hard labor and mistakes and messing up and screwing up a whole bunch, then we accidentally get ahead. It is actually a wrong picture to paint the super educated out as getting ahead by just brute intellectual strength. That is a false picture of how science works. And so many times, to even guess where to move to next, they have to guess within a range. There are things, simple things, like the orbit of a satellite that we kind of have to guess at because we can't get it precisely right because elliptical orbits and gravity and speed and that stuff is really, really complex, and we're kind of limited being men, but we want to portray this picture that we're foolproof and scientific and that the scientific reason is above God. What about the heavy reliance upon other men's eyewitness testimony and other men's formulas and other men's data? I know Christopher Hitchens is not a scientist, but one of the things he said is, I can't double check everything. I have to trust you guys. That is exactly the scenario in science. They don't have time to double check everything. They don't have time to peer review everything. Some of this they just have to take by faith. Also, why is it that there are hard sciences and soft sciences, and then why are the soft sciences portrayed as solid as the hard sciences? Yes, science is good. It has brought us discovery and medicine and pushed us into the future. These things are good and great. But to paint the picture that we are not getting ahead by trial and error, but rather by guesswork, or to paint the picture that we absolutely knew what was happening 25,000 years ago, just as little as 25, like we know absolutely beyond a doubt, and there's nothing written or recorded from that time period. But then people are like, we know it's from this time period because of this pottery. But who guessed and said it was from that time period? So there's this heavy reliance upon authority in the scientific community, when in fact we know that much of the way we get ahead is by experimental trial and error. So now, why do I choose today to pick on Neil deGrasse Tyson or to pick on science in general? It's because they have attempted to elevate themselves above God, as if their eyewitness testimony and their assumptive nature and their prideful assertions and their trial and error was supreme in some sense. The eyewitness testimonies, as mapped out in the Bible, were written by people that proclaimed that character mattered, that character mattered, that character mattered, even to a fault. I mean, the purpose of Christianity is to say, hey, we want to live in accordance with the truth. But those that are telling us that their eyewitness testimony and their eyewitness record-keeping system is superior to that of the Bible are the same ones that have created the geological column as if it exists in totality, and they just draw it in scientific books as if it's all together in one place. Or those that in the past drew fish that floated downward after they died and laid on the bottom of the pond and that, or the ocean, and that is how they became bedrock fossils. And we don't see dead fish except that they float. So do we take the eyewitness testimony of the scriptures as baseline fact, or do we accept the possible trial and error, arrogant, assumptive assertions of others?